wanted indeed to talk about the sort of difficult half of businesses' engagement in development. I suspect this morning with Gail and other colleagues from the Business Commission here, almost certainly you've heard about the opportunity side, in a way the sort of easy side, even though many business leaders don't seem to recognize it. And the opportunity side, just to quickly rehearse it, is that, we in this Business Commission looked at the extraordinary gap between what it will take to fund the SDGs and the current level of finance going into their achievement, and saw something of a $3 trillion gap a year, a lot of it in infrastructure, but not exclusively, a lot in things like health and education as well. And we looked at the quantum today of total ODA, and even when you include non-OECD measured amounts, you're still only at about 160 billion a year, most of it already committed and deployed. So it doesn't do much to help you meet this $3 trillion gap. Obviously, a huge portion of that gap will be covered by better resource mobilization by national governments. But probably half of it has to be covered by increased private sector investment in these areas of often so far viewed as intractable development problems, the difficulty of building out infrastructure in Africa, the challenges of urbanization in Asia, etc., etc. They've typically been enough to make businessmen pass by on the other side of the street. And, difficult to finance, difficult to complete, lots of currency risk, regulatory risk, the lot. And yet, what we saw in this report, where we had 35 very eminent global CEOs engaged with us, was that actually in these sectors, the opportunities, if anything, have 2 to 3 times the return of traditional business opportunities. Yes, the capital requirements are often more long-term, they require more patient waiting for the return, but when it comes, it's going to be much higher than in traditional sectors. Those sectors we looked at, urbanization and mobility, the transition to renewable energies, food supply and agriculture, and healthcare. And, in those sectors, we identified $12 trillion of business value creation by applying principles like the circular economy and the shared economy, by transitioning to renewable energy solutions across a whole array of activities. But so in our view, and we recognize it's not shared in every boardroom in the land, let alone across the world, there is a huge opportunity. And, certainly our number one task is to try and open the eyes of CEOs and boards to this, and for them to understand that correspondingly, if they don't do it, not only are they conceding the critical growth areas of their businesses to competitors in the future, but secondly, they are, as fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and children themselves, consigning their families and their broader societies to a much lower growth, much more unstable, much more resource expensive world. So, the opportunity and correspondingly the risk, if the opportunity is not seized, is clear. But I wanted to sort of really concentrate on the second point today, which is, how does today's business position itself in a way which recovers the legitimacy, the permission, the license to operate in these kinds of markets? Because, think about it. What is development about? It's about the world's poorest, most vulnerable, least legally protected people in the world. And suddenly we're saying that big mining companies, big consumer goods companies, big infrastructure companies, somehow have a solution to these people's problems. Now, of course, we're saying they've got solutions to all people's problems because the SDGs are global, but it is where the need is greatest is concentrated at the bottom of the global social and economic pyramid. And it is a jump and a leap of faith to believe that individuals and those in development in civil society and the UN and elsewhere who sought to protect groups like this against the ravages of unmanaged capitalism should suddenly turn to their former persecutors for solutions. And that, I've tried to frame it as sharply as possible, what, in a way, the challenge is. Because, you don't need to go to the very poor to find that business is held in great distrust in today's world. I mean, the annual Edelman Trust Barometer was very tough this year on pretty much all institutions, but businesses amongst them. CEOs got a real trashing in this year's confidence numbers. And it's part of a general meltdown of respect for institutions. We're seeing a crisis of political parties. We're seeing a crisis of political leadership. It goes without saying. We're seeing some of the most turbulent political times ever. And, to the extent that politics is impacting on business at the moment, it's a pretty negative way, because you've got, protectionist drives through Brexit here in the UK, but, through Trump and his sort of anti-trade policies in the US. And generally, across the much broader swathe of global politics, you are seeing a much more authoritarian sort of age of Caesars, who are much more transactional in their political leaderships, much less committed to the sort of global soft power values system reflected by, say, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, or indeed by General Assembly endorsement of things like these SDGs, the global goals. That is not the mood and tenor of a lot of political leadership in the world today. And so, how does good business cut through and prevail in this context? And we, in our commission report, call for some pretty obvious things. And, as I say, I termed it early in our work a social contract, where businesses paid taxes in the countries where they generated the earnings, that they were transparent about how they accounted for earnings across their global markets and across where goods were produced, that they made sure they complied with minimum labor rates, that their supply chains were much more transparent about reducing exploitation by third-party vendors. Issues which, are, in a sense, I expect, at the heart of the work that many of you all do. That ESG and other issues of that kind were properly respected and reported on and transparently met. But ultimately, it's a much bigger transformation in the relationship of business to society than is captured in these individual kind of reporting and standard setting issues I mentioned, because we are in an era where global isn't very good anymore. It's the world condemned by our current Prime Minister as elites who belong nowhere. It's the increasingly disenchantment that the meeting of the great corporate global and good at places like Davos is properly, I think, greeted with growing skepticism by people in general on the street. And where the re-questioning of the basic sort of economic model can be seen in the dramatic vote by younger voters in the UK election for a Labour Party with a manifesto which may not be practical, which may not be realistic, but which captured the anger of people, a generation, whatever their socioeconomic condition, about the difficulties of getting a foot on the housing market, the difficulties of university debt, the difficulties of decent first jobs. And so, and that is not peculiar to the UK. I see it in much more extreme forms, where you have much higher rates of youth unemployment, across developing countries as well. So, in this environment, it's not enough for a large corporation to tell its public affairs department to go out and tell the world what it's doing in ESG. The issues of trust are much more profound and fundamental than that. And it really is, therefore, about, how does, business remake its relationship with society? And, if it is to preserve the efficiencies that come from global supply chains and global markets, then it must find a model of much greater local accountability and with that transparency. It's got to accept a much more full-blooded scrutiny by civil society, not just the formal, larger civil society reporting and benchmarking groups reflected in a room like this, but accountability too to local communities and to, their leaderships around their presence in a particular community, whether as a retailer or a manufacturer. And a new relationship, too, with government. I think, another trend of current government is, I sort of think almost a rebellion against red tape. Half my family's American. We live a lot of our time in the US. And, while I, like everybody else, was not like everybody else, but like half America was appalled by President Trump's win. We were not, in that sense, it wasn't just this sort of blue-collar rebellion that it's often portrayed as in the British press. There were a lot of perfectly sensible people from middle-class professions, financial services, elsewhere, who voted Trump just because of the frustration at the regulatory burden of modern America, this feeling that, there wasn't any activity you took where there weren't reams and reams of box-ticking pages to be filled in, and there was impatience for the glory days of the past where you could get on and do it in terms of, building a factory or whatever. And obviously some of that same impatience with regulatory process infected also the Brexit vote here in the UK. And to my mind, it's been interpreted as an anti-sort of regulation drive across business. And I think that's to slightly mischaracterize it, because I think, it's regulation as endless process and box ticking that has gotten stuck in people's throats. I think what we've lost along the way, as the tragedy of the fire last week showed, is regulation as a really effective tool for making sure that contractors and companies meet standards which are critical to the protection of safety and life. And somehow, you look at a table like this, all of us are in a sense part of the problem, because there isn't one of us who cannot, I'm sure, deny that we haven't put up some new regulatory box for a corporation or an individual to have to fill in, because it's kind of the way we think about these things. And we have to stand back and say, how do we put the relationship between the market and business and the market and government, back on a much more strategic base, where senior leaderships of corporations take it seriously because they understand the regulation has a purpose. It's to stop a bank going bust. It's to stop a contractor building an unsafe building. And, we've somehow drifted so far from that. We've created industries of people filling in forms for other people to write new forms for them to fill in. When I look at the compliance cost of a modern corporation as someone who sits on the board of a bank, the number of loan officers we've had to get rid of and replace by compliance officers. And yet I simply cannot put my hand on my heart and say that the banking sector is safer today against the likely next kind of financial crisis it may encounter than it was in 2008. So we are constantly new generations of regulation to fight yesterday's crisis, and we've drifted away from what I think the voters here in the UK were asking, and certainly I saw it in the US, which was, let's have a much more strategic relationship between government and business, where business understands that government does kind of hold the ring to make sure that business acts in the broader social good and that its behaviors comport with that, but where government in turn finds ways of applying that control and relationship with business in a way which doesn't dissolve into this very sort of bureaucratic, process-driven approach that characterizes so much of government and the private sector's interactions today. So in sum, what I wanted to challenge you all with was there's a great opportunity out there for business to tackle some of the world's most intractable problems. It's an opportunity characterized by much higher financial returns than what businesses are for the most part currently doing. It's an opportunity for tremendous innovation and disruption, because some of the biggest new development solutions are just that, the M-Pesas in East Africa introducing mobile banking, or M-Kopa now introducing solar energy to households. There are revolutions taking place which are business generated by people who mind their P&Ls and therefore are able to continue to extend their services to new customers. But the price of doing it is a high one. It cannot be the business model under which we have lived for the last 50 or 60 years. It's got to be a business model which is much more respectful and accountable to the societies where it operates and lives and works. So, I sometimes say, and, in doing so, I always know that to someone I'm going to say, knew the damn guy was a socialist behind all that. But, it's a world where we've got to, yes, in a degree, privatize development, but where we also have to socialize business. Thank you. And I think there is an opportunity for a few questions, right?
I wondered if you could go into a bit more detail about what the role you see in global tax reform playing within that.
Let me just say, I think that, obviously tax has been, an issue which has really been a tool for a race to a bottom often. It's not been, strategically used between countries in a way which will, secure a globally more fair and equitable distribution of investment. And in that sense, I'm a great believer in global tax reform in the sense that I don't think, there's no level of global governance, not the World Bank, the IMF, nothing else, which will or should have the right to set global tax rates. But a much more transparent discussion of taxes and a transparency by countries of what their tax offer to corporates is and what the benefits to corporates from those taxes are, is, I think, key. And as I've said, the other half of it is, a acknowledgement by corporates that if they operate in a country and try to, as we've seen so many cases in recent years here, not pay tax in the country in which the sale is made or the goods manufactured, then that is building up massive political trouble for the future. So, just in general, a much more transparent debate about this, with a principle of paying tax where the economic value is created, seems to me at the heart of it.
I'd be very interested in when you mention that the many detractors from globalization and the pull, the need to have more local governance. How do you see that balance adapted? How do you see, what is in your view the right balance here?
Let's take the other one and then we'll do them both.
I was involved on a ground level in the 2017 general election. It was depressing in a lot of ways because the politics were particularly unthoughtful. And that seems to be a global trend. How do we generate more thoughtful politics, more considered politics, more politics which actually thinks about these broader questions that you've surfaced so well?
Well, thank you. I mean, look, I think when Nikki and I were discussing this at lunch, I think we are at a moment where, our political system has become completely detached from where people are in terms of the issues that matter to them. And I think, it's why, quite clearly, literally what was being said just did not resonate with people at all. It was from a different world, almost. And why do I think that politics has become detached? Because, fundamentally, I think, I have watched in my sort of international political life, the extraordinary gains from globalization of greater rates of poverty reduction and wealth creation and increased life and health expectancies, health outcomes, than at any time in human history. And I've then watched all of that hit the buffers, because the consequences have been not just sharp increases in inequality, geographically heavily concentrated in Europe and the US in terms of losers from this burst of globalization, but also political cultures which have reacted against the perceived loss of control and the increased insecurity in people's lives. And so we have two political parties in the UK which are riven by internal fault lines between globalists and nationalists, basically, between Remainers and Brexiteers, to use the proxy issue of the day. And, until that is reconciled and our parties align much more with this fundamental argument, which I think is going to determine politics for the next decades, I think we will have a politics which simply doesn't address public concerns and issues. There is no perfect answer, but, what we've seen is a situation, and again, it sort of goes on, I've seen it building as long as I've been involved in international development, is, that economics is getting more globally integrated because it produces bigger gains for the global economy. But that has prompted a reaction for greater local control. I have just watched the push for decentralization in country after country. I just yesterday was talking to somebody about the political situation in Ghana, where, the recent presidential campaign promised one factory in every constituency. And, it's just the latest version of this push for, a local politics and a local control where there is both some economic decision-making capacity for local decisions about choices and some control over it. So again, it does actually, I think the two questions are related, because I think it is again an expression of this sort of detached politics that we have. And, I think different countries will come up with different solutions. And, the context of my conversation with Ghanaians was, don't make the mistake of Kenya, where they've already gone down the path of decentralization, and it's hugely corrupt. And so, local solutions are not always better. They require systems around them and accountability and transparency, at least as much as national approaches do.
Do you feel more optimistic about the potential for a country like Ghana to be able to go down this decentralized path, or less optimistic, given your years of experience?
If you take Ghana, or you can take two countries beside each other in that sense, take Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Ghana is suffering hugely at the moment from the depressed cocoa price, and is struggling because it should have a large oil and gas industry, and mismanagement by the previous government has meant that the industry is still not delivering the revenue it should have been delivering for the last 3-4 years. And the reason it largely isn't is, frankly, corrupt political interference. Cote d'Ivoire, a country that has emerged from civil war, similarly affected by the depressed cocoa price, but booming, because, a post-Civil War government under sophisticated leadership has, attracted foreign investment, is taking on the challenging infrastructure issues, is got a very well-regarded plan for diversifying the economy. So, and I hope Ghana will learn from it. And I think the new leadership in Ghana is good and great. And I hope they, will be able to get the country back on track. But I give those two examples because, what I've also learned from a lifetime of doing this is no country, and it's the same no doubt with a company, ever does better than the quality of its leadership. And people elect great political leaders who are able to effect extraordinary change and set a strategic direction for decades, which takes countries from, poverty to middle income status. We've seen it, with a South Korea, which, when I was in my teens, South Korea was poorer than Ghana. Today it is many times richer. And so, what I've seen is that, and I've always felt as leading international development efforts, that we can do, probably the best thing we can do is bet on good government. When you have good leaders, bet on them, because those are the countries that move. And, it in the corporate world, well-led companies, are the companies which win market share, strengthen their share price, et cetera, et cetera. Countries aren't that different. And, you take the UK as a classic example. Go back a few years, the UK gave every evidence of being a well-managed, strategically directed country which knew where it was going.